Hello and welcome to the third episode of the full stack blog application tutorial. In this episode we're going to build the signup method. So first of all, open up the services.proto file and add a new method to our auth service. So type RPC signup, which takes a signup request, and it returns an auth response. Then we need to create the message SignupRequest. So type message SignupRequest. The SignupRequest contains a string called username, a string called email, and a string called password. Now let's compile the services.proto file. So open up the terminal, change your working directory to proto, and type proto c services.proto and provide the flag go_out equals plugins equals gRPC column dot and hit enter. Now we can close the terminal and the services.proto file and open up our service.go file. As you can see, we get an error because the signup method isn't defined yet. So let's define it. Under the login method, type func, and it belongs to the auth server. Its name is signup, and it takes again a context which we aren't going to use, and in, which is a pointer to proto.SignupRequest. And the signup function returns a pointer to proto.authResponse and an error. To make our program compilable, return a pointer to an empty proto.authResponse and nil as error. As you can see, the error is gone. So now we can start defining our signup method. First of all, we again want to get the values from our request. So type username, email, and password equal in.getUsername, in.getEmail, and in.getPassword. Now we can start validating. So in the next line, type if, and we want the username to be at least 4 characters long. So type len of username is smaller than 4. Then we want to return a pointer to an empty proto.authResponse and a new error that says validation failed. Of course, we need to type a username here. The next thing to check is if the username isn't too long. So type len of username is greater than, let's say, 20. Then we also want to return validation failed. Then let's do the same for the email. So the email has to be at least 7 characters long, and it mustn't be longer than 35 characters. And the password must be at least 8 characters long, and it mustn't be longer than 128 characters. The last thing we need to check is if the email is valid. To validate the email, we're going to use this regex. You can copy it from the video description. So type match and underscore equal regex dot match string, and the first parameter is the regex, and the second is the value we want to test. In our case, it's email. So In the if statement we can add, if match is false, we also want to return validation failed. The next thing we need to make sure is that the username and the email are unique. Of course we could just test this in the signup function, but in order to provide real-time validation to our frontend, we need to create methods within our services.proto file. So switch back to the services.proto file, and in here we can say RPC email used, which takes an email used request, returns a used response. We're going to define these messages later. The second thing we need is the RPC username used, which takes a username used request and which returns also a used response. Now let's define the messages. So type message username used request, and it consists of a string called username, and the message email used request consists of the string called email, and the last message we need is the message used response. This simply has a boolean that's called used. Again, we need to compile our file, so open up the terminal, hit the up arrow to call the latest command and hit enter. Back in our service.go file, we need to create the new functions. So again, type func auth server, which has the name username used. Again, takes a context and a request, which is proto.username used request, and it returns a pointer to proto.used response and an error. Again, just return some nil values in order to make the program compile. So return a pointer to an empty proto.used response and nil. Then we can copy this function and just replace username used request with email used request. And of course username used with email used. Alright, so now we can implement these functions. The first thing we need to do is create a database context. To do so, type context and cancel equal global.new database context, and the duration is 5 times time.second. Just as always, we need to defer the cancel func. And now we can query the database for a user who has the username we get from our request. So above the context, type username equals in.getUsername. Now let's create a new variable called result of type global.user. And then we can write global.database.collection user.find one and pass our context and a filter which is bson.m, and we want the username to be the username we get from our request. And then we want to decode the result into our result variable. So we pass a pointer to the result variable. So if there is a user who has the username we get from our request, the result will not be global.nilUser. But if no user has the username we get from the request, the result will be global.nilUser. So we can simply return a pointer to proto.usedResponse and then type used equals result doesn't equal global.nilUser. nil user. And as error we return nil. Alright, so now we can write test cases for this function, but in the signup function we need to return something in order to make it compile. So again, return pointer to an empty proto.authResponse and nil. Now we can place the cursor in username used, do a right click and click on Go generate unit test for function. This will generate this new function in our service underscore test.go file. Again, delete the function body. The first thing we need to call is global.connectToTestDatabase. Now again, let's create a new instance of the auth server and we can start testing. So type response and error equal server.username used, and again we have to provide a context. I'm going to use context.background and a pointer to proto.username used request, and the username should be Carlo. Of course, if there's an error, we want the test to fail, so type test.error. An error was returned and append the error. Now we can say if res.getUsed and again log an error and simply type wrong result. Again we need to nummerize our test cases, so type 1 before each error log. Then we can do the second test case. Again res and error equal server.username used. Again context.background. And now we pass a pointer to proto.username used request. And now we use Carl as username. Again, check if there's an error. We can just copy the if above and paste it down here and replace the 1 with the 2. And now we can say if not res.getUsed. We can again copy the error log then log wrong result. Now let's run our tests and hope that everything works. As you can see, everything worked perfectly. Next, let's open up Chrome and have a look at our database. So go to cloud.mongodb.com and log in with your account. Then click on the Collections button and have a look at the blog application underscore test database. As you can see, there are many documents in our user collection, but actually we want this collection to be cleared before every test is run. So open up Visual Studio Code and go to the database.go file within our global package. In the connect to test database function, we now want to get all collections in our database. So type collections and underscore equal database dot list collection names. To call this function, we again need a context. So type context and cancel equal new database context, and as duration we're going to use 30 times time.second. Again, defer the cancel function and then enter the context as parameter. As filter, we're just going to use an empty bson.m. Now we can loop over our collections variable. To do so, type for underscore and collection equals range collections, and then for every collection we want to call database.collection, and the name will be our current collection, and we want to drop it. To call the drop function, we again need a context, so just copy these 2 lines above, but instead of 30 seconds we're going to use 10 seconds. Then pass the context as parameter. And I just saw that we're still using context with timeout here, but actually we should use our new database context function. So let's delete this and type new database context and 10 times time.second. And the same above. Just copy this and replace it. Alright, so now we can close the database.go file and go back to our service test and run the test. Now go back to Chrome and refresh. And as you can see, we only have the document from the last test in our user collection. Great, so now we see that our username used function works. Let's develop the email used function. So scroll down until you reach the email used function. Actually, we're going to do the same, so just copy the code. And instead of username, we want email. And also call the getEmail function. And then here we also have to use email. And the same here. And that's it. Again, we need to generate unit tests. So click this item. And again, delete the function body. And actually we can also copy the unit test from above. But instead of username Carl, we're going to use email carl@gmail.com. And instead of username used, we're going to call email used with an email used request, where the email is carlo@gmail.com. And in the second test case, we're going to use the email carl@gmail.com. Now we can also run this test case and again hope that it works. Alright, so now we developed the email used and the username used function, and now we can continue with our signup function. So delete the return, then outside the function let's create a new variable called server of the type of server. And here we can now use the methods of our server variable. So type response and error equal server.username used. Then pass in context.background and a pointer to proto.username used request, where the username is username. Now if we get an error, we can just log.println and let's say error returned from username used and append the error, and we want to return a pointer to an empty proto.of response. and a new error that says something went wrong. If we don't get an error, we can use the res.getUsed method in order to see if the username is already used. So type if res.getUsed returns true. We want to return a pointer to an empty proto.auth response, and again a new error which says username is used. Then let's add an empty line here just to make it look better. And then we can do the same for the email. So just copy this block. Here we don't need the column anymore because the variables already exist. And then we don't call username used, but email used with proto.emailused_request, where the email is email. And also here we have to replace username used with email used. And here we have to replace username with email. Alright, so if the username, the email and the password are valid and the username and the email aren't used already, we can now create our new user instance. So let's say new user equals global.user, and as ID we're going to use primitive.newObjectID. As username we're going to use username. As email we're going to use email. And be careful about using password as password, because we need to encrypt the password before inserting it into the database. So above the new user, let's say password and underscore equal bcrypt.generate from password, and here we have to enter a byte array. So let's convert our password to a byte array, and the cost we're going to use bcrypt.defaultCost. And now we can use the string value of the password variable for our password. So type password equals string of pw. And the only thing that's left to do now is insert the user and generate the token to return it. So let's create a new context to insert the user into the database. So type context and cancel equal global.newDatabaseContext, and as duration we're going to use 5 times time.second. Again, we need to defer the cancel function. And now we can say underscore and error equal global.database.collection user.insert1, and we need to pass the context and the document to insert, which is new user in our case. Of course we don't need the column here because error is already defined. And then we can check if we got an error. So type if error doesn't equal nil. We want to log.println error inserting new user and append the error. And we also want to return the same as above, namely the error which says something went wrong. If we don't have an error, we can return a pointer to proto.authResponse where the token is new user signup.getToken and nil is error. And that's it for the signup function. Again, we need to create test cases. So click into signup, do a right click and click on Go generate unit test for function. Again, delete the created function body. And what we now want to do is again connect to the test database. Then we want to insert a document again, in this case with email carl@gmail.com, and the username will be Carl, and that's it. Now again create a new instance of the auth server and we can start testing. So in the first test case we're going to use Carl as username, and of course we want it to fail. So type underscore and error equals server dot signup. Again we use context dot background and a pointer to proto dot SignupRequest, and the username we choose Carl. As email, let's take example@gmail.com, and the password will be example string. Then we can check if error doesn't equal the error we return when the username is used, namely this one. So if error doesn't equal username is used, we can say test.error no or the wrong error was returned. And again add a number, because if something doesn't work we can identify the test case. The next test we want to do is the same, but with the same email as our inserted user. So let's type underscore and error equal server dot signup context dot background, and we need to pass a pointer to proto dot SignupRequest. As username we're going to use example. As email we will use carl@gmail.com, and the password will be example string again. Of course we don't need the column here. And again, or actually we can copy this thing and add 2 here, and we want to have email is used of course. So the next test case we want to work, so we can say res and error, or actually we don't need to res. So again type underscore and error equals server dot signup context dot background again, and here pass a pointer to proto dot SignupRequest. As username we're going to use example. As email we will use example@gmail.com, and as password again use example string. And now we can say if the error isn't nil, we just want to log test case 3 and an error was returned. And let's add another test case where we want the validation to fail. So again type underscore and error equal server dot signup, again context dot background, and a SignupRequest. Just use the same as above. But the password must be shorter than 8 characters. So let's use exam as password. And now we want the error to be validation failed. And if the error isn't validation failed, we can again use the same as above, but now it's test case 4. And again, let's run our tests and hope that everything works. As you can see, the tests failed, and that's not a good sign. So let's have a look at our code. What's wrong here? Oh, of course we have to use a greater than operator here, and not a smaller than. So replace the smaller than operator with a greater than operator, just like this is. Save the file and run the tests again. And as you can see, the tests passed, everything is fine, and our signup method works. So that's it for the signup method. In the next episode, we're going to build the auth-user method. The auth-user method takes a token and returns the user which is authenticated with this token. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, comment, and see you next time.